Hey, all right, so these are going to be review slides for test number 2, that test you need to take this week. There's more information about it on Blackboard, and that's where you will take the test, is on Blackboard, and I think everything there is covered here, basically. So I'm going to go through this fairly quick. So we are starting, hang on, there we go, with Descartes. That's just the stuff at the very end. So in particular, remember the last question, or one of the questions on the first test, I had like 8 kind of answer possibilities. Have that question in mind. You might see it again. Also, just the general ideas about ontological dualism. That is, the outcome of his view, the implication about reality being two different kinds of stuff, mind and matter, or the idea that there's an essential difference between mind and body, and how this leads to the problem of interactionism. That is, the interaction would have to occur between these things, but on Descartes' terms, that's incomprehensible, basically. So interaction itself is not the problem. It's a problem for Cartesian dualism. That's all you really need to, those points basically from Descartes. When you turn to D'Holbach, remember he's the materialist, right? A monist, so he's against dualism. Everything is matter. There's 2 main things he's saying about it, that it is active and that it is heterogeneous. So here I'm just saying about the heterogeneity point, right? There are common properties, right? All matter has something in common. That's why it's all matter. But it's a genus, remember. It's not one specific thing. It's more like a family. All the individual members of that family, so to speak, have their own particular or peculiar properties, right? So for him, there's an empirical view. It's strongly based on an idea of mechanism, of deterministic natural laws that do not change, and we are part of this. So that's the denial of freedom. Just some more looking more closely at the points about active and heterogeneity, you'll just see here, right? The idea of seeing matter as passive or inert rather than active is a really bad thing because it always leads us back to something equivalent to dualism. That is to say, there must be something in reality in addition to matter if matter is passive. But when we recognize it as being inherently active, then it becomes clearer that it could be all we need. And then there's the point again about the heterogeneity, where we don't have to deal with the implication that somehow the reality of everything is ultimately the same. We can say, as things appear to our empirical perception, basically, they have different properties. That's okay. That is just a fundamental feature of matter, that organized into different forms, it will indeed have different properties on the basis of those common properties. Don't forget the common ones, like extended and divisible, for example. Basically, so he just thinks this deals with the main objections that stand in the way of making a convincing case for materialism, basically by dealing with those peculiar features of us as human beings, or rational faculties in particular, basically. There is just the point about freedom, right? That is denied because everything we do, just like anything else that happens in reality, is determined by relevant natural laws. Some of those we've discovered, some of those not yet. Nonetheless, they are there, they must be. That's D'Holbach's view. This is supposed to be illustrated. You remember the game we played, the Brainiac and the boxes with those green boxes. You remember that basically. The idea is supposed to be that if you do believe, either just as we initially most of us do, that you have free will, that is to say your choice couldn't possibly be predicted because it hasn't even been made yet, then you will always take both the boxes, right? Remember, there's 2 options. You take both or just the closed box, right? So if you think you have free will, you'll take both because that seems rational. You get whatever's there, right? If, however, on the basis of the new experience you get, when you see the pattern emerge that everybody who does choose both doesn't get the million, and anybody who chooses only the closed box, that is to say, believes that their choice is indeed predictable, therefore in effect already made or determined, they pick just the closed box and they always end up much happier because they get $1 million. So basically, if you do believe that your choice could be predicted by Brainiac, then you would just choose the closed box. Right? That's how you get $1 million, right? You get $1 million when you believe your choice is predicted, and when you do that, that's when you choose just the closed box. So That was Dolbach. On to Berkeley, the idealist monist. So still a monist, right? Remember, monism is just the idea there's one kind of thing, not two, as in dualism. Here we just take the other path and think that it's all ideal. It's all mind, no matter, basically. This is meant to be. Keep this in mind because it's one of his best points. A really strictly, very purely empirical position, right? Because you can just see the conclusion very quickly, right? When you really do base your claims about reality on your experience and you recognize, well, of course my experience is ideal. It's the thoughts, the perceptions, and so on that are going on in my mind. Well, it stands to reason that if you do really just base your claims about reality on that, then you will draw the conclusion that reality is ideal. Basically, you can think about this, we looked at it like this, basically putting 2 points together. There's, from his perspective, the good common sense view, this common sense certainty about, really obvious empirical experience. Things are real, right? We're not wrong. That's a common sense view that he combines with the more philosophical observation or claim that our experience is ideal. That's not in conflict with the common sense view, but it's not itself sort of a common sense idea, right? When you point it out to people, they may readily agree, but it might not have occurred to them to think about it in that way. But for Berkeley, it makes good sense, and you just put those two things together, and basically you're there. There will be an idealist just like him. So that's kind of how Philonous goes about it in the dialogue, basically, right? Thinking about intense heat as that key kind of example, which is just supposed to show, right, that the content, the object, whatever it is we're experiencing through our perception, there's always a kind of subjective aspect, right? How we are affected. Those are inseparable. That's what seals the deal for him. That's what makes it all ideal. It's all part of our experience. And this wants to then, so he goes through the secondary so-called properties and basically says, well, the same thing applies all the way down to the so-called primary, meaning the very existence of things is ideal. That's what he wants to show. And this just conclusively, just absolutely once and for all does away with worries about skepticism. It just says there is no gap between one's experience on the one hand and that reality that we are experiencing on the other. There is no gap. There's no possible way that any doubt could creep in. Again, here's the little rundown of that argument. I don't know if I need to go through every single step here, right? But the idea is just the singleness, right? That the unified nature of our experience is fundamental here, right? That the experience of intense heat, for example, is just one experience after which we can kind of analytically dissect it, so to speak, and then start thinking about how the heat could be there and the pain over here. But he thinks that if you take that experience just as it comes, then you will draw the conclusion that the heat and the pain are inseparable and therefore on the side of experience and therefore ideal. And that is just what goes on to be generalized. Okay, and the master argument, right, basically you cannot conceive literally of anything that would be independent of our experience because, of course, any thoughts that we could conceivably be having are themselves thoughts that are not independent of our mind. So that's probably some other things here that's, I think, I've more or less said. But basically all of this for Berkeley, just very clearly, if you really, really stick very strictly to the evidence of experience, then you will be an idealist. That's the main thing. So have a look at all of this. Now, there is the Hume stuff. Basically, we did the wrap-up, which is more or less the same here. But here are the things you just want to make sure that you're on top of. The distinction between impressions and ideas, the distinction between relations of ideas and matters of fact, right? Relations of ideas are just defined that way. The denial is a contradiction. And this is what we think about through deductive reasoning, right? Deduction is where, in effect, the answer is already given, and you just sort of extract it or make it more explicit, right? With matters of fact or empirical questions, basically, that's what we deal with through inductive reasoning, which basically means the answer we're looking for is not already there, right? This is basically the way. Whether it will rain tomorrow, that is not contained somehow already in today's or yesterday's weather. We're adding something, we're saying something new. That's why it's more or less probable and not certain, basically. So, and we look at this in terms of constant conjunction, as we've talked about, basically. This is the same stuff here, basically, about the assumption, same cause, same effect, the principle of regularity, right? That reality functions in the same way, right? Gravity is not going to be different next week than last week, for example. Things work the same way. The only problem really is that our perception just never, it didn't in the past and it never will, perfectly, directly, immediately clue us into what's actually going on. Right? We work with a kind of disadvantage. We try to make the best of it. But part of that situation is that we have to make that assumption, basically, and it's an assumption that, as we've discussed several times, you can never really prove. Right? And again, it's the principle of habit and the belief, or I just combine those here as habituated belief. That's basically what's going on when we're engaged in inductive inference. There's nothing wrong with that. Some scientifically minded people might be bothered by this if they thought that somehow scientific empirical reasoning was somehow a cut above and was not tied to things that had to be taken on faith. But Hume's observation is basically, well, it is like that. Right? You have to start with the belief, take that assumption in effect on faith. That's how we reason empirically, and we can never come back to lend direct support to that assumption, because all inductive reasoning presupposes it. It's always a prerequisite, so to speak. What else we got here? We got the personal identity, right? You can do that again, and the idea about freedom basically as compatibilist, right? That is to say, he's reconciling freedom and necessity. Typically, people see those as counterposed, as opposites, one or the other, like Dolbach, for example. So he wants to say, unlike Dolbach's view, freedom is real. He can say that, and most people find that more appealing than Dolbach's denial, right? And that just means it overlaps with necessity, right? Just when you're self-determining in the sense that your will is the cause of your actions, basically. So he thinks that's fine. Now, as far as the test goes, you don't probably have to worry about some of the further considerations we entertained that were, sort of critical of that view. But just be clear about what he's saying about that freedom is those things, right? Your will is determining your actions. When you're doing something, if it's because you willed, then you're free. If not, then you're not. Fairly simple kind of view. He's just doing that to make good sense of what we mean by freedom. The best sense is made when we see that it's necessity in that form. I think that's it, actually. So if you can go over those things, I've gone it very quickly here because I have time limits on these videos. But basically, if you have questions, whatever, I'll have special office hours on Zoom. I'll put that information on Blackboard, too, if you have further questions about this that you want to clarify before you plunge in and take the test.